Picture a girl, 4 years old. Her mother walks out the door and doesn't come back. There's no explanation, no goodbye, just gone. She's left with grandparents who are cold, who drink, who hurt her in ways a child should never be hurt. There's no safe person. There's no soft place to land. There's just survival, starting, again, at 4 years old. And by 11, she's pregnant. By 14, she's living in the woods behind her childhood home because she's been thrown out with nowhere to go. She is surviving the only way anyone showed her how. And the world that was supposed to protect her, it looked away every single time. This is where Aileen Wuornos begins. Not on a Florida highway, not with a gun in her hand. Here, in the woods, is a child that nobody came for. And I want you to hold on to that image, because everything that comes after makes a lot more sense when you do. Welcome to GBRLIFE Transmissions. I'm your host, Caitlin, and you're listening to GBRLIFE of Crimes, where we explore not just what happened in crimes committed by women, but why they happened and the psychology behind them. Today, I'm doing something a little different, and honestly, something I have been sitting with for a while now. This is the case that started it all for me. Aileen Wuornos. She was the first episode ever of this show, and I will be the first to tell you, I was just getting started back then. I wasn't ready to tell this story the way it deserved to be told. I'm ready now. So today we're going back, further than we have ever gone with this case, into the psychology, into the failures, into the questions that the justice system never wanted to ask out loud. This is Aileen Wuornos, revisited. And this time, we're not leaving anything on the table. Aileen Carol Pittman was born on February 29th, 1956, in Rochester, Michigan. And from the very beginning, the odds were stacked against her in ways that most of us never fully understood. Her father, Leo Dale Pittman, was not a man she ever got to know. He was a convicted child molester who was imprisoned before Aileen was ever born. He was later diagnosed with schizophrenia, and he died by his own hand in prison in 1969. Aileen was 13 years old. She never met him once, and her mother, Tyria Wuornos, was just a teenager herself when she had Aileen. And in 1960, when Aileen was just 4 years old, Diane decided to walk away. She left Aileen and her brother Keith with their maternal grandparents, Lori and Britta Wuornos, and she did not look back. Now here's the part you need to pay attention to, because this part matters. Aileen and Keith were legally adopted by their grandparents, but that adoption was not warm. It was not a loving fresh start the way it may have sounded. Lori Wuornos was a violent alcoholic, and the home was not safe. It was not stable. And that abuse that Aileen experienced inside those walls was severe. We're talking about SA from her grandfather. Let that land for a moment. The man who was supposed to be her protector, her only male figure in her life ever, was one of her abusers. And her grandmother, by most accounts, was either unwilling or unable to stop it. And by 11 years old, Aileen was harmed by a friend of her grandfather's. So this was not by choice. She was 11 and she became pregnant. She gave birth to a baby boy in March of 1971, and that baby was given up for adoption. She never got a say. Nobody asked her what she wanted. She was a child who had been violated, and the world just moved on around her like it hadn't happened. And shortly after that, her grandmother Britta died. And not long after, Lori told Aileen and Keith they were on their own. But Aileen was only 15. 15, with no home, no education, no family, no support, and a body and a mind that had already been through more trauma than most adults ever experience in a lifetime. She moved into the woods near her old neighborhood, and she survived by doing what she had already been shown. She used her body, but she was a child living outside, selling herself to survive, and not a single person in any position of authority stepped in, which is why the arrests also started young. The system saw her, it just never asked why. Now, before we go any further into her story, because if we don't understand what's happening inside of Aileen's mind, we're going to make the same mistake the justice system made. We're going to look at what she did without understanding what was done to her first. So, let's talk about the psychology. Aileen was formally diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, also known as BPD, and post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. And when you understand what those diagnoses actually mean, not the clinical textbook version, but the human version, the real human experience of living with them, everything about Aileen starts to make a different sense, but a different kind of sense. BPD is almost always rooted in early childhood trauma. And to be clear about something, because there's a huge misconception about this disorder, BPD is not about a lack of empathy. It's actually the opposite. People with BPD feel everything at an intensity that is almost impossible to describe. Every emotion is amplified. Every perceived rejection feels like abandonment. Every relationship feels like something that could be ripped away at any moment. Because for Aileen, relationships had been ripped away at every moment. Remember, her mother left her at 4. Her grandfather violated her. A family friend harmed her. And her grandmother then dies. Then her grandfather throws her out. Every single attachment that she ever tried to form was either dangerous or just gone. So her brain learned very early that people leave, people hurt you, and you cannot afford to trust anyone. That's not a character flaw. That's an adaptive response to an environment that was genuinely unsafe. Now layer PTSD on top of that. PTSD rewires the brain's threat response system. When you experience repeated trauma, especially during childhood when your brain is still developing, your nervous system gets stuck in survival mode. You are constantly scanning for danger because danger was always there. And you're hypervigilant. You act first and hard because hesitating has gotten you hurt before. For Aileen, by the time she was an adult, her brain had spent years being shaped by one message. The world is not safe. People will hurt you. You have to protect yourself because nobody else is coming. And then there is the generic piece that almost never gets talked about. Her father was diagnosed with schizophrenia. Well, that matters because mental illness has a biological component, and Aileen came into this world already carrying a genetic vulnerability. She didn't just experience trauma, she was also predisposed to being more deeply affected by it. So what you have is a child who is biologically vulnerable, placed in an environment of restless abuse and abandonment, with zero, think about that again, not one human intervened. There was no treatment and no one supported her. And we're surprised by what she became. And here's what I want you to understand from this. The psychology of Aileen Wuornos is not a mystery, but it is a roadmap. And every single stop on that map has a name. And that name is a failure that someone else made first. By the time Aileen was in her late 20s, she had been living on the margins for over a decade. Arrests, drifting, surviving, no stability, no safety, no one. And then, in 1986, at a bar in Daytona Beach, she met Tyria Moore. Tyria was younger than Aileen, quieter, more grounded, and something clicked between them almost instantly. They became a couple. And for the first time in Aileen Wuornos' life, she had something that resembled a real relationship, a home base, a person. Now it's time to think about this clinically for a minute, because it's important. We just talked about BPD and how it's rooted in terror of abandonment and an inability to form stable attachments, because every attachment Aileen has ever had was either harmful or taken away. And here she is forming one, loving someone, building something. That is not what a human being starved of connection finally does when someone offers it. Aileen supported Tyria. She paid their rent. She took care of her. In many ways, Tyria became the person Aileen was doing everything for. And that matters enormously when we get to what happens next, because when law enforcement closed in, they used Tyria to get to Aileen. They coached Tyria to call Aileen and draw out a confession over the phone. And Aileen confessed, not because she was caught or because she had no choice, but because she could not let Tyria go down for something she felt was only hers to carry. She loved Tyria more than she loved her own life. And in the end, that love was used as a weapon against her. Again, love, companionship, parenting, anything good was always used against her. So what were these crimes? Between November 1989 and November 1990, 7 men were shot and killed along Florida's highways. Aileen was responsible for all of them. I'm not going to minimize that. 7 people died. And we need to talk about it honestly. But I also need to talk about something that mainstream conversation around this case never actually addresses. Who were these men? What were they doing? Well, Aileen was a sex worker, operating alone on Florida highways with no protection and no recourse. The men she encountered were not random strangers. They were her clients. And the world that sex workers operate in, especially in that era, was really dangerous. There was no one to call, and no one would believe you. No legal protection whatsoever. If something went wrong out there, you're on your own. Aileen's consistent claim from the very beginning was that she killed in self-defense, that these men became violent, that they attacked her, and that she responded to protect herself. Now, the prosecution in all of this, once she got caught, and as we discussed, it's because they started to realize who it was, and they used Tyria to lure her in. And the prosecution, once the trial began, painted that as one giant lie designed to avoid accountability. But let's look at the very first victim, because this is where the case against the narrative starts to fall apart. Richard Mallory. He was the first man that Aileen killed in November of 1989. She said he raped her and brutalized her before she shot him. But the prosecution dismissed this. The jury dismissed this. And Mallory was largely portrayed as an innocent victim. Except Richard Mallory had a prior conviction for violent sexual assault. He had served time in prison for it, but that information was never presented to the jury. They deliberated and convicted without ever knowing that the first man she killed had already been convicted of doing almost exactly what she said he did to her. Now, were all 7 killings clear-cut self-defense? Now, that's a harder question. And I'm not going to pretend otherwise, because forensic analysis of the cases suggests that some of the killings were more reactive and fear-based, while others are harder to explain cleanly through a self-defense lens. And that complexity is real. But here's the question that I ask all the time. If a man had been raped and brutalized and had no legal protection and no one willing to listen, and he started carrying a gun and using it when he felt threatened, would we call him a serial killer? Or would we call him someone pushed past his breaking point? Aileen didn't kill in an organized manner. Nothing was ritualistic, and there was not this behavior of calculated predator who enjoyed what she was doing. The evidence all points to impulsive, reactive, emotionally charged. That is forensically significant. Because there's a difference between a serial killer and a traumatized person living in survival mode who finally started fighting back. But the justice system was never interested in that distinction. Today, we are. And by late 1990, law enforcement had connected the highway killings and were building a profile. This is how they started to realize it was Aileen. Composite sketches were starting to be released, and tips were starting to come in. In January of 1991, Aileen was arrested on an outstanding warrant at a biker bar in Volusia County. But before her arrest, investigators had already identified Tyria Moore as someone connected to her. And we know the painful part here. Law enforcement brought Tyria in and offered her immunity in exchange for her cooperation. Tyria agreed. She was coached by investigators to call Aileen, who was already in custody, and to draw out a confession over a series of recorded phone calls. Aileen, believing that she was protecting Tyria from persecution, confessed. She told Tyria that she would not let her get in trouble, that she would take responsibility and she would handle it. We talked about this already. She was protecting the person she loved the most in the world. But we really, really need to understand how it sealed her fate, because her demeanor after arrest was immediately weaponized against her in the court of public opinion. She was loud, she was angry, she was defiant. She did not cry in the soft, remorseful way that made people comfortable, and that was exploited within the media. Immediately, she was labeled a man-hater, a predator. What a monster. Nobody stopped to ask why a woman who had been through what she had been through might be a little angry. Aileen Wuornos was tried, convicted, and sentenced to death. And the trial itself was one of the clearest examples that I have ever come across of a system deciding the outcome before the process even began. Because there was another diagnosis that she was given, ASPD. During her trial, forensic evaluators diagnosed Aileen with antisocial personality disorder. But that was given to her alongside BPD and PTSD. And on the surface, that might sound like just another clinical label. But in a courtroom, antisocial personality disorder is a death sentence before the jury even deliberates. Because what that communicates to a jury is she has no remorse, she has no empathy, and she cannot be rehabilitated because her nature is dangerous. And here's the thing, that diagnosis was completely dishonest in Aileen's case. Borderline personality disorder and antisocial personality disorder are almost clinical opposites. Borderline personality disorder is an excess of emotion, a terror of abandonment, a desperate need for connection. Antisocial personality disorder is characterized by a fundamental absence of those things. You cannot have textbook presentations of both simultaneously. They literally contradict each other at their core. Plus, we all know that Aileen loved Tyria Moore so deeply that she confessed to murder to protect her. She cried, she begged, she formed attachments. She feared being abandoned. Not even 1 ounce of that is antisocial personality disorder. But all of that is borderline personality disorder. So why did that label get applied? Because it was convenient. It was reframed a traumatized, broken woman into a predator by nature. And once you're a predator by nature, the state can execute you and feel justified. And her attorney failed too. The defense that was mounted on her behalf was thin. The critical information about Richard Mallory's prior conviction for violent sexual assault never reached the jury. The trauma-informed context that could have reframed everything was never built or presented. And then there's what happened to Aileen on death row. She deteriorated. She wrote letters to the courts claiming prison staff were using pressure chambers with head-shrinking devices on her. She became paranoid and delusional. Her mental state unraveled in ways that were visible and very well documented. And in her final years, she recanted her self-defense claims entirely. She said she made it all up. She said she was just a serial killer who wanted to rob men. Then I want to ask you something. Do you believe that recantation? Because I don't. Not entirely. What I see is a woman who spent years in isolation, whose mental health had been deteriorating without adequate treatment, and who had been let down by every single person that she ever trusted, including her own legal team, and who had reached a point of complete psychological collapse that she may have genuinely lost her grip on what was real. Or she was a woman so exhausted, so beat down, so done, that she decided to just give them the version of herself they always wanted, the monster. Because at least then it would be over. And it was over, because she was executed on October 9th, 2002. She was 46 years old. The state of Florida killed a woman who had been failed by every single institution since the day she was born. And they did it with a clean conscience, because they had paperwork to prove that she was unredeemable. Modern forensic psychology looks at Aileen Wuornos very differently than the 1992 courtroom did. Today, a trauma-informed defense would have been built around her entire story, not just the crimes, the childhood abuse, the developmental impact of sustained trauma on a forming brain, the genetic predisposition to mental illness, the complete absence of any intervention or support at any point in her life. As a matter of fact, it was the complete opposite every time. A jury today would have heard a very different story. The conversation around sex workers and self-defense has also shifted. Slowly and imperfectly, but it has shifted. The idea that a sex worker cannot claim self-defense because of the nature of her work is something that advocates and legal scholars are actively challenging right now. Aileen's case is often cited as one of the starkest examples of how that bias played in a courtroom. And now, Ryan Murphy is bringing her story to a mainstream audience, again with Monster Season 4. And I have complicated feelings about that because on the one hand, more people are going to learn about Aileen. But on the other hand, the way her story gets packaged for entertainment often strips away exactly the context and nuance that matters most. So let me be direct about where I stand. Aileen Wuornos was not a monster. She was a child that the world discarded, and then an adult that the world punished for not surviving gracefully. She did things that caused harm, that's true, but she also experienced harm relentlessly and without relief from the very beginning of her life. We failed her as a child. We failed her as a teenager. We failed her as an adult. We all failed her in that courtroom, and then we executed her and closed the file. The least we can do now is tell the truth about who she actually was, while also saying that it's not acceptable to kill anyone. 7 people, no matter what they did, were also killed. And that was not okay. She should have been held accountable for what she did, but not the way they did it. Not the way they hurt that little girl at 4 years old with her mother walking out the door, or the woods behind the house, the hunger, the cold, the men, the silence of every person who could have helped, but didn't. No one came for her then. But we can do something now. We can refuse to accept the simple version of her life, and we can ask the harder questions. We can hold space for that truth that a person can cause harm and also have been a victim of harm. That both things can be true. That the world is rarely as clean as a courtroom verdict makes it seem. Aileen deserved way better. She deserved it at 4. She deserved it again at 11 and at 15 and in that Florida courtroom and on death row. She deserves someone to finally see her clearly. And I hope this episode did that today. This has been GBRLIFE of Crimes, part of GBRLIFE Transmissions. I'm your host, Caitlin, reminding you that understanding the darkness helps us appreciate the light. Join me next time as we uncover another case that challenges everything we thought we knew about the criminal mind. Hey, it's Caitlin. If you stayed this long, a big thank you. And if you could also do one more thing by liking and subscribing each time you listen to GBRLIFE Transmission. That would mean the world, and it would really help GBRLIFE Transmissions grow. Also, don't forget to check out the reviews and blogs on GBRLIFE.com. There is so much more GBRLIFE has to offer. Can't wait to see you there.
Breath between the words we choose. Stories in the spaces we don't fill.